Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Infinite Sea, Nelson's Navy, Melville, and Billy Budd. This is the Director's Insight Talk for Billy Budd Week here at DMMO. I'm Kristine McIntyre. I directed the show in 2017, and I'm joined today by Dawn Coleman. Dawn is an associate professor of English at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, who has written extensively on Herman Melville and actually lectured with me back in 2017 when the production was new. She's the author of Preaching and the Rise of the American Novel and is the book review editor for Leviathan, a journal of Melville studies. Welcome, Dawn. Thank you for joining us.
My
so
pleasure.
Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
And we're also joined behind the scenes today by Scott Ahrens. He's our stage manager. So if you guys hear me asking Scott for something, that's who I'm talking to. All right, we've got a lot of material to cover because Dawn and I love to talk about Melville and Billy Budd. So we're going to get right to it. So the first thing to say is that Billy Budd was a novella, and therefore an opera, that almost didn't happen. Melville was working on Billy Budd when he died in 1891, and it was very much the cherished and labored work of his old age. He wrote it much more slowly and carefully and meticulously than he had other works, maybe like Moby Dick, which came out in a sort of an explosion of youth in comparison. His wife, Elizabeth, made the fair copy, but Melville died before the book was finished and published. And we owe the manuscript's existence to Elizabeth, who, after Melville's death, carefully tied it up with string and put it in a metal bread box for safekeeping. And there it stayed. And I think we actually have a picture of the famous bread box. There it is. Mm-hmm. Melville's granddaughter, Eleanor, eventually inherited the box along with the rest of Melville's literary artifacts. And in 1919, when a scholar named Raymond Weaver was writing a biography of Melville, he visited Eleanor, and she presented him with the manuscript, which the Melville women had so carefully preserved. So we really have them to thank for the fact that we still have Billy Budd. And here we have a copy of the manuscript itself. This is actually, I think this is the first page. Yep. And you can see it with some of Melville's corrections. So this is the source material that we almost didn't have, but are so grateful that it was preserved. Dawn, can you give us a brief summary of what Billy Budd is actually about?
Sure, I will try to make it brief. First, I'll say I love this story and this opera, even though it breaks my heart every time. It's less iconic than Moby Dick, maybe less well known, but still a masterpiece. In many ways, it's a more compelling story. It's shorter, it's tighter. It has Captain Vere, who is much easier to relate to than Captain Ahab. And the story also raises big questions about justice and leadership, so it always feels relevant. You can see from this picture, the story has a big cast. It's set on a British warship, but the story itself, the heart of it, is really about three main characters. And so we have Vere and Billy and Claggart. And the story begins when handsome young sailor Billy Budd is impressed onto the Indomitable. All of the sailors love him, except for Claggart, the master-at-arms, who hates him, mostly out of envy. So Claggart sets out to destroy Billy. The story's crisis comes when Claggart goes to Captain Vere and claims that Billy is plotting mutiny. Vere doesn't believe it. He's incredulous. He's been watching Billy. He just doesn't think that could be the case, but he has to act. So he calls Billy to his cabin to respond to the accusations. Billy comes, Claggart sings out his lie, and Billy is horrified and tongue-tied. We've learned earlier that he has a stammer that acts up under stress, and now unable to speak, he hits Claggart in the forehead, and Claggart falls to the deck. He's dead. So Billy has now killed an officer in wartime. And what can Vere do? He assembles his court, and they soon pronounce their fateful verdict. It's really just a heart-wrenching story, and it makes for a magnificent opera.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. That was a very good short summary of the story, I have to say. So now let's talk a little bit about, I know that's not an easy thing to do. Let's talk a little bit about the setting for Billy Budd. So the year is 1797, and the opera is set on a British Royal Navy ship called the HMS Indomitable. And the ship itself is a small microcosm of British society. It's sort of set against this exciting backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars. Ships like this really reflected the sort of class structure of the society, and they could be a very cruel and unforgiving world. The particular ship that we're talking about is a third-rate 74. So it's a three-masted, square-rigged 74-gun ship of the third rate. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a good ship. It's not third rate in the sense that we often use the term. It just means that it had between 64 and 80 guns. And as you can see, there was rigging everywhere, sails everywhere, and men everywhere. These ships were very, very crowded. It was not dissimilar to the HMS Victory, and we're going to look at some pictures in a second of the Victory, which was Admiral Nelson's ship. The Victory was a first rate, so it was actually bigger than the ship in Billy Budd, but the basic idea is the same. And in the opera, we have three basic locations where all of the action takes place. So the first one is the deck. And here we have the deck of the Victory. So the big thing is that it's open. There's really sort of nowhere to hide. And you can imagine that it's fairly crowded with a lot of men doing the work that it takes to keep a ship like this afloat. The second location is the captain's cabin. Here we have Nelson's cabin, but Vere's cabin would have been very similar. So it's a private retreat for the captain. It's quiet. It represents power, but it's also very isolating. And Vere himself acknowledges his sense of isolation, both from his fellow officers and also from his crew. He's aware that he has this privileged position, but that it keeps him away from everybody else. And then the third area is the underdeck. So in a ship like this, the crew would have actually lived on the gun deck and slung their hammocks right over the cannons. We actually have a close-up picture of what that looks like. So you can imagine it's very crowded. You can see there's not a lot of headspace. There was only about 5 feet. So even back then, most of the men would have had to duck all of the time. The guns were very, very heavy. You can see that it's a huge gun and it's on a kind of wood cradle. They could be moved around a little bit with ropes, but they weren't going to move them enough that they could, sleep comfortably. So they had to sling their hammocks right over. All right, so these ships were like a pressure cooker. You had a lot of people crammed into a very little space. Now, the time period specifically, the Napoleonic Wars. Britain had been at war since 1793, and over the next 2 decades, Britain would only see about 13 months of peace. Let me say that again, because that's really an extraordinary thing. In 20 years, Britain would only see 13 months of peace. So, this was the time of the great naval victories. This was Nelson's time. But it was also a time of unrest within the British Royal Navy. It was the time of the Great Mutinies. The first of these mutinies occurred at Spithead, which is off the coast of Portland, when the crews of about 16 ships refused an order to set sail. They wanted things changed. So they put all of the officers ashore. They didn't hurt anybody. They got a delegation together, and they created a list of demands, and they sent those demands to the Admiralty. And the demands were basically 3 things. Number 1, they wanted a raise in wages. British sailors had not had a raise in 150 years. Number 2, they wanted better treatment for the sick and wounded. And number 3, they wanted a better quantity and quality of food. And guess what? They won. This etching is actually the men at Spithead cheering the fact that they've been awarded everything they asked for. Most of their demands were immediately granted. The Admiralty knew that it needed to make some changes. And so they granted the demands and the fleet set sail. Now, the following month, there was another mutiny at the Nore, which is at the mouth of the Thames River. But this time, the Admiralty and the government suspected that it was politically motivated. Specifically, they suspected that there was French Jacobin influence, that the French were trying to influence British politics. So the demands this time were rejected, and the mutineers tried to blockade the mouth of the Thames, which did not go over very well. They were isolated, and the entire episode ended with violence when the mutineer leaders were hung. So it's really important to think about the time of the mutinies and how this affects the storytelling of Billy Budd. And in the slide, you can see. So we have Spithead, we have the Nore, and then right after that, the events of the novel and the opera take place. Now there's some critical disagreement about the nature of the Nore mutiny, whether or not the French were actually trying to influence British politics. But certainly, at the time, it was a deeply troubling and deeply embarrassing event for the Navy. And it factors into the opera. The officers actually sing about their shame about what happened at the Nore. the Royal Navy at this time was basically a small floating monarchy, and it really, really depended on discipline. The captain and the officers were greatly outnumbered by their sailors. You would have had about 600 crew and only 12, maybe 14 officers. And so about a sixth of the ship's company were actually Royal Marines. They were there to act as police, to keep the peace, to keep order. And Vere and the officers are really keenly aware of the threat, and so discipline was very, very important to them. So these mutinies and this need for discipline are sort of the backdrop, and maybe Dawn now could tell us a little bit about the characters in the novel and the opera.
Yes. Right. So that context is so important. And in the context of the war, and especially right after those mutinies, there's so much anxiety. And that's when Billy comes onto the scene in The Indomitable. And he is just a breath of fresh air for everyone. He's a reminder of everything that is not war. His beauty, kindness, and friendship. The narrator compares him in the book to Apollo and to Adam before the fall. So there's always a glow, sort of an aura around Billy. And I think Craig Verm is really a brilliant choice for the role. And just, one example from the opera, when you see his goodness, which seems like not to fit on a warship, is when, the dancer wants a plug of tobacco. Well, Billy gives him one. He's just a tremendously compelling character. But a powerful personality like that is also kind of oddly a dangerous element on a warship. Because even though Billy is totally loyal to Captain Vere and to his king, he has a kind of power that Vere doesn't, not quite. Vere has full legal authority on the ship, and the men admire and appreciate him, but Billy has charisma, and that just comes directly from the men's love for him. Now, one thing about Billy that just makes him such a moving character is that I think as a character, he meant a great deal to Melville, because he's based in part on Melville's two sons. And you can see them there, Malcolm on the left and Stanwix. This picture is from 1861. So Malcolm there is 12. And both of his sons died young. Malcolm died in 1867 when he was only 18 years old of a gunshot wound to the head. That was probably suicide. And then, not long before Melville started writing Billy Budd, his second son, Stanwix, died, age 35, alone and sick in a hotel room in California. So the story comes for Melville from a place of deep love and grief and maybe guilt. And I think it's that sense of guilt that Britten homes in on. So moving on to Claggart, his nemesis. John Claggart is the one man who has it in for Billy. He's the ship's master at arms, which is like a chief of police role. And he is like the original bad cop. He's malicious, he's secretive, and he really has it in for Billy. Now, why? This is a real question in the book, too. In the book, the narrator says that we can never really know, that there's a mystery of iniquity to his character. But we do have some clues. Claggart seems to envy Billy, to resent a goodness that he can never share. And he seems to be attracted to Billy. But given the prohibitions on same-sex love, he can do nothing about it. Claggart's behavior toward Billy, of course, is incredibly appalling. But when you realize the full context around him, there's a real poignancy to the fact that he could just never have that free and easy relationship with Billy that all of the other men do. Okay, Captain Vere. So Billy has the title role, but this is really Vere's play. It's his ship, he has full authority, and he's the one who has to decide how to handle the bomb that falls in his lap when Claggart accuses Billy. Vere begins the opera, maybe not so much the book, but definitely the opera, as an exemplary wartime leader. He's a father figure to his men, starry Veer, and he maintains order easily because the officers and men love him and are loyal to him. He's also a character with real depth. Melville gave Veer depth, and I love that Britten and Forster picked up on this, by making him a reader and a thinker. Veer spends his free time reading and pondering the classics. In Act 1, he sings Plutarch, the Greeks and the Romans, their troubles and ours are the same. And that is just one of my favorite lines in the opera. It's not in the book, and it just suggests that across the centuries, we keep living the same stories over and over again. Okay, so also say in the book, but it's important here too, Veer is compared with Lord Nelson, and Kristine has already mentioned Lord Nelson's ship as a first-rate ship, and that Veer's is a third-rate ship, and it is, excuse me, absolutely true that those terms don't quite mean what they mean today, and yet there's a running comparison of Veer and Nelson that sets up a parallel and a contrast between the two men. And if Billy Budd, the story, had ever had a 19th century audience, they wouldn't have needed the references to Nelson because, a British naval leader in the Napoleonic Wars immediately invites that comparison. And in the novella, the narrator says that Nelson commanded his men with his mere presence and heroic personality. Now, Veer is a good fighter and he's beloved by his men, but the story's crisis, that set of decisions he has to make, suggests that he's no Nelson. So,
and that really leads us to a fascinating difference in the treatment of the character of Veer between the novel and the opera. Now, one could argue that Melville is quite critical of Veer, but the opera takes a slightly different approach, and two of the opera's most striking and important differences vis-a-vis the character of Veer actually came from Benjamin Britten himself. So the first was the idea that the opera would focus on Veer's moral crisis. Now, E.M. Forster, who was one of the librettists, and Eric Crozier, the other librettist, were both convinced that Billy Budd should be the centerpiece of the opera, and that makes sense, right? But Britten said, I must admit that Veer, who would seem to me to have the main moral problem of the whole work, round him the drama was going to center. So this idea, this shift of focus, really came from Benjamin Britten. And he said one of the reasons was that he saw a connection between the character of Peter Grimes, who was the subject of an earlier opera, and that of Veer. And I think the other connection obviously comes from his life partner and muse, Peter Pears. Pears was one of the great tenors of the 20th century. He was the original Peter Grimes. He was the original Veer. Britten wrote the part for him. And Pears was very interested in Veer's moral dilemma. Veer, was a fascinating character to both of these men. And so Britten decided that rather than condemning Veer outright, he was worth exploring in a different kind of depth than the novel had done. The second thing that Britten did that made this story quite different from the novel is that he made it a memory play. And he decided that the memory of Veer would frame the entire piece. So you have an older Veer looking back. And this is at both the beginning and the end of the opera. But as is so common in the works of Benjamin Britten, this is not a technique to say, oh, we have an omniscient narrator and you have to believe everything he says. Just because Veer is technically the narrator, he is not necessarily omniscient. And in fact, I think we are meant musically and dramatically to question his version of events, to question what we're being told, and to acknowledge how much guilt and pain there is in the retelling of the story. It's a really different take on storytelling as a mechanism and this particular story. And I think it actually gives us, the audience, more agency to question Veer's actions and his viewpoint. Why is he telling us this? Is he telling us the whole truth? What's he trying to convince himself of? What is he trying to convince us of? And it really brings home the idea of history as lived and remembered events. So Dawn, let's talk about the climax of the story and this moral dilemma that Veer winds up with.
Yeah, so this is really the heart of the story. And here with this picture, you have the moment when Billy has just killed Claggart, and the photographer has caught Veer at his moment of absolute horror. But I would also point out that the events leading up to this moment have been highly irregular and have involved real choices for Veer as well. So Claggart has come to him, has borne false witness against Billy, and Veer knows this intuitively, even though he doesn't have proof. And he knows too, and he reminds John Claggart that to accuse someone falsely, especially of mutiny, is itself a hanging offense. So Veer at that point, right, instead of calling a drumhead court after Claggart makes his accusation, decides to settle it privately and calls Billy to his cabin so that he can, face his accuser directly. And there are no other witnesses. And as, of course, it turns out, this turns out to be an explosive situation. So now Billy has struck Claggart, and Veer has another ethical dilemma on his hands. And it's really that one that is dramatized and is at the heart of the story. From a legal point of view, under the Articles of War, Billy has to hang because he has struck his commanding officer. And it doesn't even matter that, technically, legally, that Claggart has died. The blow alone is a hanging offense. But of course, Claggart is dead. Veer has to act. It seems very straightforward legally, but morally, of course, you've had a situation where someone who's innocent has reflexively defended himself against a really heinous charge. So Veer has to decide. What he does is he summons a drumhead court, basically a court-martial for Billy. And that's there in the book too, but it's rather different. He does tell the men here in the opera that they must act quickly because the enemy is near. And but beyond that, there are a lot of changes from the book to the opera. In the book, Veer gives the court a long and erudite speech that points to the court's duty to obey the Articles of War. He basically tells them not to follow their consciences, to follow the law, to follow their king. In the opera, Veer's anguished but largely silent, and the court, with regret, but has to come to that decision on its own. So that revision really softens the sense that, which I think is more present in the book, that Veer pushes for Billy's death, through that long speech, because he fears, and this is where the mutiny context comes in, he fears that if Billy isn't hanged, the sailors will mutiny, that they will perceive that discipline is lax, and that if you kill your commanding officer, you can get away with it. Britten's Veer comes across as less concerned in this moment about mutiny, although it's certainly present earlier and mentioned and discussed. But his silence here at the crucial moment, his silence instead of that big speech, makes for a much more ambiguous situation. Right. So I think is Britten trying to, at least as I would see it, Britten trying to redeem Veer's character a bit. So thinking about these larger issues of the tension between law and justice, takes us to a perennial problem in America, which is that these questions of law versus justice so often come back to issues of race. And here we have a picture of Melville's father-in-law who had to decide on a very important racial question in ways that really prefigure Veer's decision, and that scholars generally think that he had in mind, Shaw here in his writing of Veer. So one of Shaw's defining moments as the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court was that he had to decide soon after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law whether or not to send an escaped slave back to slavery. So the fugitive slave law, remember, is required Northerners, to send slaves back, even if they themselves were personally opposed to slavery. So soon after the law passed, a Black man who escaped slavery, Thomas Sims, was captured and brought before Shaw's court in Boston. Abolitionists protested in the streets. They even wrapped the courthouse in chains. But Shaw took the fugitive slave law as clear and binding. That was the law, even though he personally opposed slavery. He ruled to send Sims back to Georgia, and off Sims went. So we have a question with Shaw. Was he a good man who was forced to support injustice in order to uphold the law and his oath? Or was he a leader who failed to take a moral stand at a really crucial moment? And I think it's those exact same questions that haunt Vere. It brings us back to the question of when, if ever, should someone defy the law? And I think anyone watching Billy Budd gets sucked into that same drama. And it's a little frustrating, but I think both Melville and Britten are more interested in having us face that question and think about that issue than in answering it for us.
I totally agree. Although I would say there's one thing that happens towards the end of the opera that maybe indicates what Britten actually felt about this question. And that is this extraordinary moment of resistance from the crew. So Billy has just been hung from the yardarm, and suddenly all of the sailors start to make this amazing guttural noise. It's one of the most amazing sounds when you're hearing the opera live. They start in their throats. Eventually it becomes an ah. And it feels like they barely have words to express the anger and the frustration that they feel at the injustice, as they see it, of Billy's hanging. And the sound grows and grows louder musically. And you actually feel the rebellion in the music. And the situation becomes very dangerous. The officers feel it. They know they have a very small window of time to reassert their control. And so they order the Marines to block the stairs up to the quarterdeck and to aim their guns at the sailors. The sailors actually come surging forward in the music to confront the Marines. And there's this moment in the opera where you just don't know what's going to happen. Is this the third mutiny? Spithead Nor? Do we now have the Indomitable? What is going to happen? Somehow the tide turns and the crew is actually forced off the deck and back down into the hold of the ship. The officers have reasserted their control. Order has technically been restored, but at what price? And I think we're left asking what this crew will feel about Vere going forward. You can't imagine this group of men who have stood facing these guns together singing Starry Vere at any point after this. And then the next thing we hear is Vere as an older man trying to make sense of what happened. Dawn, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that I totally agree, and that this sound, the guttural sound that rises from the men, is incredibly powerful. And it's there in the book. Melville wrote that sound in. So even though it's really an inspired addition to opera, it was something that Melville imagined happening. And one thing Melville was interested in were like elemental political feelings. And the officers, you see this book and opera, the officers, when they're deciding in that drumhead court setting what to do about Claggart, they have political feelings too. Their political feeling is actually in Billy's favor, but they follow the rule of law and squelch that feeling of justice. And here you have another form of political feeling, just with all of the men rising up. And in a way, it's maybe more clear in the book, but Vere has really miscalculated because he has thought, if we don't, enforce the penalty that's due and hang Billy, then the men might mutiny. And actually, he's created a situation that is more likely to result in mutiny. which again takes me back to
Yeah.
the point of what does great leadership look like. And Melville, presents Nelson, rather I would say unironically as a great leader. And he's thinking about how do people fall short of greatness in leadership. And honestly, that's what makes Veer so easy to relate to, because how many of us are heroic leaders, right? Like Veer's kind of like,
he's so human. I know. It's actually, I think it makes the opera more inviting in a way, because he is so human, and we can imagine being in that position with him. And we know that he admires his men, he admires their camaraderie, he's personally affected by their love of him. And it costs him in his soul when he makes this decision. And I think that ultimately is the point of the monologue that both begins and ends the opera. You hear him processing, you hear the guilt and the shame, perhaps, of the decision that he's made.
Yes, I would agree with that. Mm-hmm.
We have a few questions, so why don't we go ahead and get to them. So Jacqueline Thompson has asked, did the librettist's personal sense of law versus justice inform the departure from the book? Yes, possibly. I mean, I think it certainly does in terms of Benjamin Britten's view of Veer, and his personal interest in the moral quandary. Britten loves questions that are not easily answered. And Dawn was saying how both Melville and Britten pose us more questions in a way than they answer. And I think that as somebody who's directed quite a lot of Britten, this is something I often find, that Britten leaves us room for ambiguity. You often come away from a Britten opera not assured of the views with which you entered that opera. He is a wonderfully complex composer, and I think he drew that out in his librettists. E.M. Forster had a very specific set of interests and almost an agenda in the way that he approached the libretto, but Eric Crozier, the other librettist, was somebody Britten had worked with a lot, and I think was probably more of the Britten camp in terms of, let's leave these things open to a bit of interpretation, and let's find the moral complexity of these characters that enables a 20th century audience that has just come through World War II and is living in a very complex world, room to make their own judgments. Dawn, do you have any thoughts about this question?
No, I think that's a great answer. I just thinking about the post-World War II context, it's just interesting to think about it, what it means that Melville wrote this so late in his career. This isn't about the librettist, but just about Melville writing this, in the late 1880s. Yes, it's about 1797, but he's also writing in a world that is, industrializing rapidly, where these structures of hierarchy and power and bureaucracies are just everywhere. And so I think that's one thing that helps it seem like such a modern play, is like, I think anyone who has been in an institution and had to think about the institutional priorities versus their personal beliefs has encountered a very Veer-like tension. So.
Well, and going back to Britten and Peter Pears just for a second, they were both conscientious objectors to World War II. And this factored heavily into their view of Peter Grimes and into the writing of Peter Grimes. They had left America and they came back towards the end of the war, and Britten talks in his letters about what it was like to go down and have to register in London as a conscientious objector when all of his country had been through the Blitz, and this immense negative feeling that people had against him and what it felt like to be an outsider politically and morally, living in Britain at the time. And I think that feeling then carries forward into everything that he writes. He was so conscious of what it meant to stand apart in that way. Great. Katie Hickok has asked, Dawn, as a Melville expert, how did your career lead you to opera? What types of things have you done in the industry? Oh, what a great question.
My answer is that you are looking on the other side of my screen at the lady who brought me into opera. I claim no expertise in opera overall, only Melville. Although before I gave my talk with Kristine in 2017, I spent way too long on, with Billy Budd and Britten and the opera, watching it many times, reading a lot about it. So I've developed a love for opera. and especially Britten. And I just, watched Peter Grimes and like, so it is still a budding interest. But I found out too, I recently read that Melville himself, went to operas and enjoyed opera.
Yeah.
And, it's like one of these things we can never know is like, did he picture himself, Billy Budd, as an opera? There's a compression to the story and a drama to it that feels like it could have been, he could have been imagining a stage. And elsewhere in his work, you see him making comparisons between like the deck of a ship and a stage. He's very aware of the theatricality of the ship setting.
Totally. He certainly does it. It's all throughout Moby Dick as well, which is the other Melville-based opera that I've spent a lot of time directing. I have I don't know if it's a dubious distinction, maybe it's a great distinction, of being the only opera director in history ever to have directed both of the operas based on Melville's novels, so Moby Dick and Billy Budd. I have spent a lot of time with Melville over the past few years. Okay, having directed a lot of Britten, do you have a favorite opera or production? Could you tell us a little bit about it? Well, no director likes to choose between her children, right? So I love all Britten. I mean, okay, Owen Wingrave, I don't know so much, but I will say that every one of them that I've directed, I have fallen in love with. And it is this idea of the moral complexity. He, as a 20th century composer, I just find that Britten has the psychological capacity to really understand people and to put that into the way that he writes music. I've directed a lot of 19th century opera that tends to be much more black, white, right, wrong, loud, soft. And I just so appreciate the way that I think Britten really reflects the psychological changes of the 20th century and what it means to be a modern person grappling with art and big questions. I mean, Billy Budd is a very special experience. I said I wasn't going to play favorites, but you don't direct Billy Budd and forget it anytime soon. And we did this wonderful cast catch up, which you guys can all watch tomorrow, I believe. And just seeing those guys again, I was right back on the ship. You never really leave the Indomitable, I have to say. All right, other questions from the audience. Now is the time. Kristine, what was your process staging the infamous battle scene? 80-some men on a small stage. How did I do it? Well, mostly a lot of homework. As you guys will see when you watch on Sunday, it's a set that has a lot of constraints on purpose. I made the decision very early that we were really going to treat it like a ship, and that meant that there wouldn't be a lot of ways to get on the deck, that all the crew would have to enter from below because that's how they would have entered on the ship for real. And that it makes a huge difference when men are having to climb ladders to get on the deck in the middle of a battle scene and tell each other what's going on and shout down into the hold and all of that. And yet you constantly see the officers above on their quarter deck. That separation of church and state as it is. Roger Honeywell as Vere only stepped foot on that deck once in the entire opera. And so setting up that world then helps you have rules that enable you to try to recreate something like the battle scene. Benjamin Britten knew exactly what he was doing. It's an incredibly carefully crafted scene. And as somebody who grew up reading Horatio Hornblower, all the Patrick O'Brian novels, I'm a Nelson fanatic. I actually know a lot about these ships. And you read the libretto and you listen to the music and you understand that this was done by people that spent their time doing the research. They knew what happened during a battle. And everybody sings the appropriate things, and it's wonderful. It was really, really hard. I'm glad I don't have to do it anytime soon. Dawn, what did you think when you actually got to finally watch our Billy Budd on DVD video recently?
I loved it. And I mentioned the casting of Craig Verne before, but also of Zachary James and Roger Honeywell. Yeah, I mean, they were all just perfect for the parts. And that was great. I also loved how you had the orchestra in the middle, so that's
a function of our theater, but it worked so well for this, and especially for the first time they let us put netting over it so that it really felt like they were down in the hold of the ship, which was great fun. So,
and I also like some of what you did during the epilogue, if you want to talk about the projections or save them.
Yeah. No, I'm a big believer of the fact that the only reason that that the opera happens, that Vere unburdens himself, is because he's haunted by what happened to Billy. Mm-hmm. And there was the temptation to save a lot of that for the epilogue portion of it, but I think it's there also in the prologue. And so, 3 phrases into Vere's opening monologue, you see the image of the hanging Billy. Because I think that that's what underlies the entirety of Vere's character and his choice to tell us this story and the way that he tells us in this moment. And so rather than actually hanging Craig Vere or doing any of the other things that other productions have done to indicate that, we did it all through projection work, because there's something about that then is very evocative of memory and the way that I think we play movies, especially movies of bad things that have happened to us or things that we're trying to work on in our heads. And I imagine that opening monologue of Vere's happens in the middle of the night. He can't sleep. He's wandering around in his robe, and he just keeps playing the movie of what happened over and over and over again. And by the end, he's able to actually let Billy go a little bit. We see Billy Budd's dead body float to the bottom of the sea. And we actually had to, I'll tell you a funny story, actually, until we get another question. Our lighting designer, Barry Steele, actually did the projections as well. And he's a photographer. And he said, well, I live in Florida, so I'll do the dead body. He dives as well. He loves to do underwater stuff. He said, I'll do the dead body stuff. And they had terrible storms the weekend that he wanted to do the filming of the dead body. He made a mummy and wrapped it in sailcloth and took it to the beach and dropped it off a cliff, jumped in the water, and then filmed it. And sadly, we wound up not using those shots because there was too much silt and sand in the water. But he said the really weird thing was that he did this on a public Florida beach and nobody questioned him. And he thought it was very odd that he managed to film for, an hour with what was obviously the shape of a dead body wrapped in sailcloth, and nobody thought it was strange in the slightest. And we actually wound up doing all the projection work at DMMO. We had to rig harnesses and film in the pool and all of that to make the projections work. Okay, great. So we are rapidly approaching our endpoint. Let me just see if there are any other questions. This is your last chance. One more question. Okay. All right. I'm going to call it. Dawn, thank you so much. It's been so much fun to revisit our lecture and Melville scholarship, which is not something that I really was very in touch with before I got into the business of directing Billy Budd and Moby Dick, but is actually a really fascinating world and not so intimidating anymore. So thank you for having been such a willing, yes, I like it or not. Thank you for having joined us again. And thank you to all of you who are watching. Just a reminder that the cast catch up, if you want to see what Craig Verm and Roger Honeywell and Zach James have been up to since we did Billy Budd in 2017. You can watch that tomorrow. And of course, the broadcast of Billy Budd, which you can watch if you're in Iowa on Iowa Public Television. You can watch it on their YouTube channel, on DMMO's YouTube channel, or join us for our DMMO Facebook Live watch party. A bunch of the cast will be there. You can ask them questions, and it's a great chance to revisit Billy Budd. And it will also be available to stream for 45 days afterwards. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you online and at some point in person again. Thanks, everyone.